the general rule is nobody one day wakes up and decides, I'm not going to do recovery anymore. Typically, it is a slow fade. It is fairly common that we'll have someone reach back out to Faithful and True after a couple of years or 5 years or a decade and want to re-engage the process. And as we talk more about what happened, it wasn't like one day I woke up and said, I'm not going to do recovery anymore, but it just started getting sloppy over time. I kept going to meetings, but I was less likely to check in. And when I did, it wasn't honest and authentic. I continued to go to therapy, but I wasn't really honest about what was going on. And so it's kind of just a slow fade. And that's part of what becomes chaotic, I would think, for the spouse, is it's not like one day she wakes up and goes, wow, something is significantly different. It's over time and gradual, which many times is much more challenging to identify.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We have a full house today with our largest group ever to join us on today's podcast. I'm Randy Everett, your co-host, and as usual, we're here with our host, Dr. Greg Miller, and we have the rare privilege of having Greg's wife, Beth, with us today. Beth, how are you?
I'm well.
Great to have you with us in person. We have Rebecca Dekkers from our staff here at Faithful and True. Rebecca is one of our counselors that meets with women, meets with couples. And then, of course, we have Jim Farm, our clinical director as well. So we have a full house today. And Greg, we've gathered everybody so that they can talk about when there are indications that a man is not following his recovery plan.
Absolutely. So we hear this often, both from the man's perspective, but also from the wife's perspective. And there can be a concern or a suspicion or even an awareness that a man is not actively involved in his recovery, that kind of he's phoning it in, or, I love the saying in AA that half measures avail us nothing. And so there are those men that are involved in recovery, but it's that half measures piece that's creating so much chaos. So in this first podcast, what we want to talk about are what might be some of the indications that a man isn't fully invested in his recovery. How does that show up in his relationships, in his activities? And what are the various ways that a man can kind of not fully be invested?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Well, I think, I just think at the workshop, and sometimes we'll have guys that come in and, we'll say, ask them how they ended up here. And sometimes they'll say, well, I'm trying to save my marriage, or, and they're here for their marriage and they're not here for themselves.
Right. I would definitely say that one of the things that impacts a man's recovery is what that motivation is. And we know clearly that if he's doing it for someone else, it's in the long term not going to be successful. We also know that that may be the initial motivation. We talk to the men, what got you to the workshop is not nearly as important as what happens when you're at the workshop. So even if they feel coerced or obligated to come to the workshop, it's what happens. Are they willing to shift to go from that external motivation to the internal motivation? But one of the things that's absolutely true is if a man's not fully invested and motivated for his recovery, it's not going to be transformational.
That's right.
As you've talked to wives, what might be some of the things that they mentioned that cause them concern or might be indications for them that their husband's not fully committed to recovery?
Well, one of the things that I see often is a sense of minimizing, not fully grasping the gravity of it, that this is a big deal, and kind of having just eyeballs to see this is a big deal, and this matters.
Right.
Yeah.
I think another thing that we see a lot is a wife's just intuition that her husband isn't fully bought in. And so it might show up as the minimizing, maybe blaming her, some real pushback if she is questioning if he's missed therapy appointments, skipping group. And there's just a sense in her of something about this doesn't feel right. And as she brings that forward, a lot of times there's some argumentativeness. There may be even statements like, I'm fine. If you would just let this go, you're just going to have to trust me.
Right.
Some things like that, of course, don't communicate safety or commitment.
Yeah. Well, one of the things about minimizing, it can show up in two ways. One is the man who minimizes, like Rebecca, you said, the significance of what he's done, the hurt that he's caused, the chaos that he's created. So he's constantly minimizing the impact of his choices. But the other way that minimizing can show up, he's minimizing what it's going to take to really experience the healing and transformation that we know is needed. And so again, it's that half measures. He may be going to group, but maybe he's doing it in a half-hearted effort. He's not doing it consistently. Maybe he does randomly see his therapist, but there's not a pattern. And so even in the effort that he's putting forth is not a full effort. And so part of the thing I think that people look for is the first line is the behavioral piece. Just, is he showing up for appointments? Is he making appointments? When he leaves the therapist, does he have the next couple appointments set up? Is he consistently going to groups? And it makes sense that if a wife is starting to recognize that the husband isn't actively participating and even his behavior isn't changing, that internal change is going to be much more difficult. For you, Jim, what's some of the things that you see as you observe men that might indicate that they may not be fully invested in the journey?
Yeah, I think for me, I go right to, kind of the condition of his heart. You know what I mean? Like, where's his intentions? One of the things I often talk about with guys in group is kind of what Paul talks about in terms of, is the guy experiencing worldly sorrow or godly sorrow?
Mm-hmm.
What that worldly sorrow is. I don't like the situation I'm in my relationship. I don't like I lost my job. But that godly sorrow is I felt bad because I acted outside of my own values and impacted my wife and my relationships. And I see that kind of, that contrite heart where it's just broken heart. And that's one of the things I notice is just from an internal sense is there's a difference there.
Well, and what can be true is there can be those men that are regularly participating in their recovery activities, but like you've said, their heart's not in it. And I think one of the things that wives are able to discern is if there's defensiveness, you've kind of mentioned that, if there's blame, it really is how they show up on a consistent, because what's true is any of us can have a bad day or a bad week. And I know in my own recovery journey, there were times that the best version of me did not show up. It's more, has this been kind of a consistent pattern over time versus just a blip on the radar screen? And it makes sense that, initially there may be a desire to believe that there's still an investment, but over time, I would guess for a wife that becomes much more difficult.
I think you bring up a really good point. And one of the things that, I often talk to wives about is the difference between looking for perfection in her partner's recovery versus allowing room for him to be human. And we're not making excuses in that. So yes, there are going to be times where it's not, it might be a little bumpy. It might not be complete smooth sailing. I think the issue at hand that we're speaking of is when what is coming to the surface is a sense that there's not a lot of internal motivation. And there is resistance to really choosing to be well for themselves. One of the things that we see sometimes is a man is getting, he's doing work to be sexually sober, and that addictive energy is shifting into another addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And so drinking is really picking up. Gambling is really picking up. And even that feels chaotic, right, for the spouse, because she's feeling like, well, okay, I'm glad some of this behavior over here is stopping, and my gut tells me that this isn't the transformation that is needed.
Right. Well, it's what we talk about a lot of times, that in AA they refer to it as the dry drunk. That they've been able to stop the behavior of drinking, but they're not addressing the deeper issues. And we've done a podcast recently on this idea that there may be some other coping strategies that surface as a man is really going after the destructive addiction piece. And what's also true is there's some self-awareness to that. I'm able to say, I'm aware that I'm eating more than I typically do, or I'm aware that I'm really watching more TV. So I have that self-awareness that I am engaging in some distracting activities or coping strategies, but I see it as a short-term experience, not this is going to be my long-term fix. And we do encourage men to go after those deeper things. And if we're moving towards our pain, it makes sense that at times we want something that will help stop the pain. When you're working with a wife and she's starting to identify these things, are there some things that you would also add to say, you might also look at this, how is he showing up in parenting, or how is he showing up at work, or whatever some other factors might be?
Surely, we talked about it in group this morning too, even that sense that moving towards a more integrated way of being, away from compartmentalization, I'm this way in this area, this way in that one, but that I have a greater ability to move to a more integrated way of being. It bothers me if I have to, if I feel like I should fudge on my taxes. Like I'm wanting that for myself to be fully who I want to be in all of the different areas.
Right.
Yeah.
One thing I would see is if there's a man who is combative, he's defensive, and he's not able to own it. That it is about, we often say, if I'm going to recover, every part of my life is going to recover. It's kind of like what you say, the way I do taxes is going to recover, the way that I parent recovers. And so for a man to just be focusing on, and this may be the thing that the wife hears, that he's not acting out sexually, and that may be true, and yet she doesn't have confidence in the other areas of his life, that there's really been a sense of transformation.
One of the other things I notice too often for wives that is an indication we're not fully committed on the recovery journey is this sense that she'll have from him, like, okay, yes, this is where we are, but let's just look forward. Let's just, what's next? Let's just look forward, and not really any sort of willingness to do the forward looking, that we're looking in the rear view mirror, even just that she might need that. It's sort of just, here we are, let's just look forward.
Right.
Yeah, I have a memory of a woman that I worked with years ago whose husband said to her, if you would just stop bringing this up, we'd be fine. Well, clearly, that's not helpful, right? Nor is that an indication that he's committed to being well. And we're not talking here about wallowing in it. That's a different thing. But there are absolutely things from the past, right, that need to be discussed, and there is a willingness to do that. Sometimes we have to get good help if those conversations get really challenging. But to only say, we are only looking forward, or you're just going to have to trust me, those kind of things don't communicate that he has a solid picture of the just the bigness of this issue.
Well, and this is one of those places where I think scripture can be misused. And for a lot of men, they'll want to argue, well, I'm a new creation, and we're going to leave the past behind, and God is calling me to something new. And one of the things I want men to understand is we can't fully enter into the future if we're not understanding the past. And those parts of, and we say this all the time at the workshop, the parts of our life that we don't look at the most are the parts that define us the most. And so it is about a willingness to, not in shame, but just in truth, to look at our story, our experiences, also to be able to have a conversation about the why of what we're doing. And I think one of the things that would be concerning is if a husband isn't willing to include his wife in his recovery journey. I think some men hide behind confidentiality. Well, I can't tell you what's going on in my group, but that's a misunderstanding of confidentiality. I can never share what's going on in somebody else's life without their permission, but I can fully talk about what's going on in my life. What I talked about in group tonight, or what I'm becoming aware of, or today my therapist and I talked about this, or this is what I'm discovering. I think those conversations help others to understand, yes, this is something that he is. I love that idea. It's being integrated into all aspects of his life. So recovery doesn't become one compartment in his life. It becomes a factor that influences all aspects of his life.
I know that often is really meaningful to wives too, the sense that my husband is able to reflect and share what he's learning about himself in group. That often, and that lack of reflection is sometimes an indication that he's not fully committed, because there's not that sense of, I always say, got his arms wrapped around his recovery. He's in an ownership position of his recovery.
Yeah. What were you gonna say?
No, I was just gonna raise a difficult issues, just to stir the pot a
Okay,
little bit.
excellent.
So one of the things that I think is kind of destructive or representative of a guy that might not be fully invested is when they're blaming their wife for their issues.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. If she had a job, I wouldn't be so stressed, I wouldn't be acting out. Or if she initiated sex, maybe I wouldn't be doing this.
Right.
You hear things like that, or you're crazy. I'm not doing that on my phone.
Yeah.
What's wrong with
Well,
you?
and part of the thing about blame is sometimes it is directly told to the wife.
Yeah.
Other times the guy's too codependent to say it out loud, but he's carrying this energy of blame, and that's part of what's being communicated or transferred to the wife. And so, yes, sometimes it is obvious that the husband is blaming her for something, but sometimes it's more subtle, and that's where that women's intuition comes in, where she's aware of there's some energy here that I don't fully understand, or maybe I can't identify, but it's that unspoken blame of you're responsible for whatever it is that's going on in my life that's not working.
And there is a kind of a gray line there. I don't know if it's a gray line, but the concept of denial, which doesn't necessarily mean they're not in recovery.
Right.
That's a coping mechanism that a lot of addicts learn early on. And my favorite definition of denial is when I develop acceptable reasons for unacceptable behavior.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I mean? And so it's not so intentional that I want to put blame on my spouse. I've learned to cope with discomfort by, kind of persuading myself that I'm doing something or not doing something for a legitimate reason.
Right. Well, and one thing that we've talked about is one of the indicators that a man is not living his life in recovery is that he's not living in the truth. And there can be a long continuum of this. And one end of the continuum is denial. I'm not really owning some aspect. I'm not present with myself. It can be as simple as a wife who says, you know what, it seems to me that you're anxious. And the husband, because he's not self-aware, says, no, I'm fine, no problem, and the truth is he is anxious. He's just not connected to the anxiety. So on one end, it's that self-awareness, so therefore I'm not living in the truth. It can also be minimizing. We've kind of already talked about that. But at the other end of the continuum are those bold-faced lies where the spouse is specifically asking a question and he is not being honest about that. And that creates so much chaos when there's an awareness that about things that are easily understood or discerned, he's not being honest about those.
I would say that this is one of the most destructive things that we experience a lot, that wives talk about. So like you said, it is, her maybe checking out, you seem anxious or you seem, irritable. And he is denying that either because he doesn't want to admit it or he isn't fully aware, But then as that continuum moves on down, like you were speaking of, that either bold-faced lying or the half-truths, where she's checking out like, hey, were you at your meeting? And he says yes, when actually he wasn't. And we've even heard so many painful stories over the years where someone was actually acting out, but using a meeting, right, quote, meeting, to hide behind where they were. That kind of a manipulation is so painful and destructive. And oftentimes, especially when it's down on this end of the continuum, if there's language coming from the husband like, you're just being controlling, you're crazy, this isn't true, she starts to wonder about her own sanity, right?
Mhm.
And it really gets difficult for her to listen to that inner voice of her own intuition. It's still possible.
Right.
And she can get grounded and do that. I want to say that's really possible. And it's very challenging when those things are coming at her.
Yeah. One thing that, again, there are times when husband may be outside of his own reality, he's not self-aware, and then he comes to that awareness and says, you know what, the other day you asked me if I was anxious, and actually I am anxious. Or, you know, you mentioned things about work and I didn't want to talk about it, but work is really difficult right now. So again, it's kind of like what you said, it's not that we do it perfectly, but we seek to do it consistently, and when we don't do it well, we come back and own it. Again, on the other end of the pendulum are those bold-faced lies where we're telling someone their perception is wrong. And we're not taking responsibility. We're not where we said we were going to be. We're not owning that this is true, you know. And I think that that end of the continuum, again, the line, and I hear the wife say it regularly, the sexual acting out was incredibly painful, and what creates the most chaos is the hiding and the lying and the deception that made the acting out possible.
It's so painful too on the front end of recovery because we're working with the wives so much to learn to listen to their intuition, to rebuild trust with themselves. You know, I always call it your instrument, which is sensing and perceiving in the world. And it's telling you one thing, and then you're getting talked out of it immediately on the heels of that. That just leads to a whole new level of chaos, you know.
Yeah.
One thing I would also want to identify is there probably are exceptions, but I would say the general rule is nobody one day wakes up and decides, I'm not going to do recovery anymore. Typically, it is a slow fade. It is fairly common that we'll have someone reach back out to Faithful and True after a couple of years or 5 years or a decade and want to re-engage the process. And as we talk more about what happened, it wasn't like one day I woke up and said, I'm not going to do recovery anymore. But it just started getting sloppy over time. I kept going to meetings, but I was less likely to check in. And when I did, it wasn't honest and authentic. I continued to go to therapy, but I wasn't really honest about what was going on. I've had guys in my group come back and say, actually, for the last 2 months, this has been what's going on, and I've not been honest about that. And so it's kind of just a slow fade. And that's part of what becomes chaotic, I would think, for the spouse. Is it's not like one day she wakes up and goes, wow, something is significantly different. It's over time and gradual, which many times is much more challenging to identify.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's spot on. And I think it's, you know, really important to name there can be some reasons that, and not excuses, right? But reasons that the work gets challenging. One of the things I heard Mark say for years was that the second half of the first year of a person's recovery was almost always the hardest in like the 5-year span.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the shine, you know, had worn off, if you will, some of the energy around it. And that's often a season where we see a lot of women saying, he doesn't quite have the energy around this. He's not quite bringing the, you know, full, just full energy to it. Sometimes when a parent dies, or a loss of a job. I mean, there can be a lot of things like that, right?
Yeah.
That create some chaos.
Yeah, well, I think that 6 to 12 month mark is kind of common for most addictions because complacency usually hits in. You know, you're far enough away from the addiction now that some of the emotional aspects of trauma comes in. And I think oftentimes wives too kind of start to allow themselves to be angry, you know, without the fear of maybe pushing which they don't push, but you know, their fear is I'm going to push my husband back into their addiction if I display anger. So I think all that happens in that 6 to 12 month mark. I think another thing that I often see with guys that kind of indicate that they're not really invested in recovery is their boundaries aren't their boundaries. you know, is they'll see their boundaries as their spouse's boundaries. And I'm having to do this, or I can't do this because my wife doesn't want me to do this.
Right. Well, and what may be true too is for a lot of men, it may not even be coming from their spouse, but they've been around recovery enough that their sense is, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And maybe I've been told in group, or maybe my therapist mentioned this. And so there can be this artificial or obligation to this boundary that really isn't mine. And so it makes perfect sense. If it's not my boundary, then I'm not going to honor it for somebody else. And I might do it for a season. And I think another thing about that 6 to 12 months is I hear it fairly often that, especially for men that have experienced a lot of consequences, there's been a lot of exposure, there's kind of this initial ride of energy out of desperation. And in that season, they can begin to believe, I'm never going to want to act out again. You know, I've gone 6 months and I've not thought about my drug, I've not wanted my drug. And maybe they're not telling themselves that it's cured or healed, but they're also believing that this has really kind of been resolved. And so it's a false confidence. And a conversation I regularly have with that man is, I have never worked with a man that at some point did not want his drug again. And so we're just going to live as if you are a part of the rule, not the exception. So let's create now some strategies for when that desire comes back. And pretty consistently, a guy will say, you know what, it did. And sometimes it is attached to a specific event. Sometimes it can be attached to something at work or something going on relationally, or like a really significant loss, like the loss of a job or the loss of a parent. But the reality is, at some point, my pain is going to get intense enough, or my chaos is going to get intense enough that I'm going to want my old medication. Because my old thinking is, the goal is to avoid pain. So if my pain gets to a certain level, then the old neurochemical shifts in to say, hey, it's time for you to take your drug again. So I think for some men, it's just, you know, we talk here about we're going to defend and build in equal measure. And so I'm going to constantly defend, even if it doesn't seem like there's an enemy right now, I'm going to make sure I'm ready when the enemy does show up on the horizon. Well, is there anything else that you are aware of, just in our closing comments, that you would say these are indications, this is something for a man to be watching out for as he's trying to assess, am I committed to recovery?
I think, you know, one of the things I noticed too is, you know, guys that aren't in recovery, they may be pressuring their wives to move back into intimacy, you know.
Or just move back into relationship.
Or back into relationship, or,
Yeah.
you know, take me back in, you know, and really pressuring them.
Well, maybe a way to say that is, for the man who's not fully in recovery, the temptation is to push forgiveness too quickly. And that pressure that a wife may feel from her spouse of, I'm doing great, things are going well, why, like we talked about, why can't you just move on? And so if there's this energy to forgive, that may also be an indication. Well, I would just say one final thing is, again, it's that caution. It's nobody just one day decides not to engage recovery. And for the men that have been to the workshop, we talk about our 3 spiritual questions. And the power of those questions is you ask those questions every day. So every day I ask, do I want to be well today? Every day I ask, what am I thirsty for today? Every day I ask, what in me needs to die so that I can be transformed and experience resurrection? Because we do know literally it is one step at a time, it's one day at a time. And so that attunement to the day, I think, is one of the things that keeps us engaged.
Fine wrap up. Really well done. Well, this has been great having you all with us today. Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Beth, and thank you, Rebecca, for joining us. And Greg, as always, thank you. Masterful. We hope that today's podcast has been beneficial to you. We thank you for joining us, for watching or listening, and we hope that these podcasts are making a difference in your life. And hopefully, a podcast like today hopefully will, if you're swaying from the track of recovery, we hope this will help you to get back on track. If you have the need for the services of Faithful and True, we invite you to visit our our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find many resources available to you. You'll find over 400 podcasts like this one, and we also have our online bookstore. We also have all the information and online registration available for our 3-day intensive workshops. Every month we do the Men's Journey Workshop. About 3 or 4 times a year we do the Women's Journey Workshop and also the Couples Journey Workshop. So thank you for joining us. In the meantime, we hope that this coming week will be a week with many blessings, great vision.